I had spoken earlier to Professor Kaushik Basu, who is, of course, a former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, former Chief Economist with the World Bank, and now at Cornell University in New York. Professor Basu, thank you very much for being with NDTV today. You know, the ratings agencies, industry bodies have all given a very grim picture of India's growth this year. What is your assessment? How badly are we going to be hit?
Nidhi, my expectation in the beginning, after the pandemic had hit and India had begun to act, was actually India will do relatively better than other emerging economies and probably come out of this pretty well when it is all over. But I am concerned about the economy, and this concern has grown over in recent weeks because of certain kinds of data coming in. And I feel what is happening is that while the initial moves were good, people were taking precautions. Yes, there were, of course, organizational problems. We do know, after all, people have suffered in huge numbers, the migrants and others. But it was felt that you need to take steps, and India was taking those steps. But what has happened subsequently is that the exit from this, exit from the lockdown is not very clear. And the market seems to be reacting to that. Being an economist, of course, I look at these fine-tuned numbers. And for the first time, I'm beginning to get worried that the good scenario which was there in front of India now has a bit of a question mark. And there's actually, I can give you one number, which is a striking number. In the month of March, and this was pushed towards the end of the March, the foreign capital outflow from India was $16 billion, 15 to $16 billion, very close to $16 billion, which is the biggest outflow in a month recorded in India. And it is also the biggest outflow from an emerging economy. This money is going somewhere. This is not globally the economy shrinking. This money is exiting India. This is, I think, a bit of an apprehension on the part of global players that India might not exit from the lockdown right, in which case this is going to be a 1 month, 2 month window. The Indian economy can begin to do very badly. And I think that would be very, very unfortunate, because India is really in a situation where if you create the space for the economy to function, and that's a dangerous game, it's a risky game, but we have to do it. You do want to control the COVID. At the same time, you want to make space for the economy to function, and we are not giving the right signals at this point of time, and that is my concern.
No, so are you saying that a draconian lockdown, if it continues, would actually cost India much more, and that India needs to find a way to reopen the economy quickly, though with adequate precautions?
Yeah, very close to that. I feel the initial lockdown was called for, but a lockdown, that one word is causing a lot of problem. You read about another country doing a lockdown for a longer time. But that word it's a multifangled term. And nowadays there are studies where the lockdown is broken up into 8 categories. The Oxford study, which has become very well known, is 8 dimensions to it. We began with all 8 dimensions lockdown. What we have to do is begin to open up on several of those, keep some of those in place. We have to, in fact, give out very clear signals. For instance, we know from the Spanish flu of 1918 that schools, you should take about 3 months of closure. So we've already had close to 2 months of closure. We should probably go on till early June. Schools should remain closed. Large congregations should remain closed. You don't allow for that. But you allow factories to open up, and for factories to function with rules, you have to allow workers to move, for which you need transportation. So India has currently done a lockdown on all 8 dimensions. There are very few countries which have done that. I feel there should be clear signals that India is creating space now for people to move, people to get into factories, get into call centers. We know, for instance, India has been a top country for global call center work. It's suffering in a big way. A part of it had to happen. Nothing India could do alone. But if we do not begin to open up now, there is evidence coming in that global capital is beginning to flow into other countries much more. China, during the period when India's capital was flowing out $16 billion, at least $10 billion have flowed into China. Vietnam is picking up capital. Mexico is picking up capital. Global businesses are beginning to move. It's a 1 month window. We have to do it right.
The problem, Professor Basu, is that in India, you may open up something in a green zone, which has already started happening, but supply chains are such that supplies come from a red zone and everything is linked. Much of our key economic activity takes place in red zones like in Mumbai. So isn't it a little more complicated for India in terms of how it opens up?
It is more complicated, but let me say something which is politically incorrect, that at times, talking to people here, friends, relatives, businesses, I feel there is a fear psychosis in India bigger than it should be. And let me just explain this. If you look at COVID fatality, and it's better always to look at fatality because we count that better than the incidence of people getting the coronavirus. COVID fatality in India and actually Africa's South Asia, if you compare with European countries, it's 500 times more risky fatality, COVID fatality. Now, I feel we have somehow overdone the fear of COVID. Yes, you can get it, but the fatality risk is 1 out of 500 of European risk in India, in Africa, in South Asia. Now, global institutions don't like to say this because the last thing you want to say is that, look, it is not quite as risky as you think, because then if it turns out badly, people blame you. But you don't want India to be paralyzed, capital to flow out, other countries to capture the space. And we have to remember that when it comes to fatality, India is 1 out of 500 in terms of risk compared to most European countries. Is it to do with the fact that we've had BCG, there is tuberculosis which has happened here, malaria, we don't know. But we know that across Sub-Saharan Africa, across South Asia, and also a lot of East Asia, the fatality rate is very low. Keeping that in mind, even with red zones, it has to be much more careful lockdown and you allow the economy to function. Another thing I should point out, India has a history of Hermit Raj, when the state gets to control everything. We don't want to slide back into that. It was removed in 1991. We've made steady progress. We don't want to get back into that, and there is a risk. There are some countries which are doing very well despite the lockdown. We want to go that way. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. There are some countries which are messing up. Turkey, Algeria, Cambodia. We should belong to the first category, and there are every reason that India had taken steps earlier where we can be in that band.
And obviously, the India situation very different from many European countries for many reasons. Every country has a unique disposition. But, you know, the focus, Professor Basu, is also on India's poor. Now, Raghuram Rajan has today estimated that it will take around 65,000 crores for the government to actually spend that kind of money and help the poor. Would you agree with that number? And when the government argues that it doesn't have that kind of money, what do they do?
Yeah, two things. With the exact number that Raghu has given, I have not done my calculation, so I don't know yes or no. But first of all, the poor are suffering in a very big way, because the suffering from not getting enough food, not being able to go home, is a slow withering away. You don't count it like COVID fatalities, but people are suffering massively. So you have to be cautious about that. You have to do things about that. I do feel government has to spend much more money. And I don't think India is that strapped in terms of money, because if you look at India's debt to GDP ratio, it is 68%. Total debt to GDP is 68%. Lots of European countries go up to 100%. India can go up quite a bit more, borrow, create money, inject liquidity, but reach money to the poor and reach food and healthcare to the poor much more than what we are doing, and that is possible. The exact figure that Raghu has given, he's a very careful calculator. So I think something like that will be right, but I have not calculated. I do believe we should spend much more, and we can do that. The Fiscal Responsibility Act also gives us space to do that during a natural calamity. We should use that in our FRBM Act and go for more spending.
Professor Kaushik Basu, thanks very much. Very important words from you there. As you said, there's just a 1 month window, as you put it, for India to act. Don't allow foreign investment to go elsewhere. And you believe that India needs to act and act quickly to open up the economy. Thanks very much for joining us.